Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Jaffe. I am Vice President and the Marketing Chair for AppSpeaks, and I'd like to welcome you all to Panorama. Our first speaker today is McCall Thomas with her topic of civil justice systems and refugee camps.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So what do we need to survive? Obviously, we need food, water, shelter. I'm also here to tell you that we need stability. We need to be able to trust the people that we're living with, to have a sanity, to have a safety net, so that we continue living there. So I have a good example of this. I was in Morocco. I was studying abroad last semester in the spring, and I was learning how to build solar panels, and I was also learning anthropology work. So I had 2 anthropology classes that I needed to write some papers for at the end of the semester. So my aunt also works at the school in Morocco, and she works very closely with a refugee camp in Fez. So here I was in Morocco, it's northern Africa. I was in the city of Fez, which is north central. It's basically the last stop before people get to Spain. So I was there. Initially, we went to our friend Freddie's house. Now, Freddie really only speaks French, so he was like my guide rather than my interpreter. So we went to his house, and he would take in boys, usually younger, usually a lot more injured, from their trip across the Sahara Desert. And I got to take some interviews with these people. One of the notable young boys, he was probably about 16, his name was Ibrahim, and he was from Guinea. And on his trip across the Sahara, he unfortunately contracted gangrene, and it made its way into his brain. And so he was having a lot of problems speaking and kind of articulating what he needed to say to me while I was asking him his questions. And unfortunately, the gangrene had also gotten into his legs, and he had gotten both of them amputated just below his legs not a week before I got there. So I was talking with him, and honestly, initially I was expecting to be really heartbroken when I talked to him, but as I was sitting there, like drinking tea with this young boy, his eyes not once left the television where we were watching FIFA. Guinea was playing that day, and he was not about to miss his team, so it was just like, it was beautiful, honestly. So we went to the camp. I was taking interviews with refugees. I was asking them questions like how their trip across the desert was, where geographically they crossed the border into Morocco, how they've been treated since they've gotten here to Morocco, and like how they go about getting their everyday like food, water type stuff. So their camp was right next to a tire shop, which is how they built their homes, and they needed every spring they needed plastic sheeting, every winter they needed blankets. So I was there. Here's some fieldwork notes that I took. I drew a little map while I was there. He's a better map. So I was there. I was taking interviews with people from Cameroon and Nigeria, mostly because they spoke English. So I was there with Freddie. It's right by the train station, right by downtown Fez. So in this camp, there's anywhere from 900 people to 1,500 people. It's a really large camp, and they divide themselves demographically, based on which country they come from, mostly to do with speaking similar languages, so it makes sense. But if you're from Niger and you make friends with people from the Ivory Coast, you can go live over there in that section, and no one's going to say anything. It's all one camp. It's just they divide themselves like that just so it's easier. And so I was there. I took some interviews, same type of questions, just gathering more fieldwork data. And Freddie led me back around this hill. I saw into the 2 restaurants. They were playing soccer in that field, and I was walking through, and I saw this big crowd of people. And it was probably like 50 or 60 people, and they were surrounding this guy, and they were beating him. They were caning him with a long rod with a ball of leather at the end, and it was honestly so violent. I didn't know what to make of it. I turned to my guide, Freddie. I was like, what's happening? Why are they doing this? And he just stood there for I don't know, like 5 lashes, and I was getting really scared, like distraught. You know, it was one of the more violent things I've ever seen with my own eyes. And some of the guys from the crowd turned around, saw me, some white American girl, and they were like, yo, you do not need to be here. They ran at me, and they weren't speaking English, but I could tell that they wanted me to leave, so I did. I left. I went straight back through downtown Fez. I got a taxi, and I went back to this church that my aunt was working at that served as a sort of soup kitchen for some of the refugees. I met up with 3 or I think there was 4 actually, German doctors, and they had given money to the church and they had donated to that camp, and they just wanted to walk around and see where their money was going. So once we met up with them, we actually went back to the camp, and my aunt had lived in Burkina Faso for a while, so she spoke that language. We were in that section of the camp talking with some of the guys, and the 5 or 6 men who had gotten caned earlier that day, they came over and they stood in a line in front of us, and they showed us their wounds. And honestly, the wounds from the caning were not half as bad as the wounds from the border. These men had gone into the forest, trying to cross the border from Morocco, trying to get into Spain, and they had gotten their legs torn to shreds by the dogs, beaten by the cops, ripped up by the barbed wire on the top of the fence. And it was I was really surprised. I thought that they were just getting beaten. I didn't have a reason. I had no frame of reference for what was going on that day. But then I found out that each demographic at that camp elects a representative, and they decide, each elected representative decides who gets caned, why they get caned, and how much, how many lashes they will get. And that's because these people go into the forest and they fail at the border. They're usually badly wounded. They come back and they're so dissatisfied with their life on the camp that they start stealing food. They start stealing money. They start beating people up. And you have to understand, I talked to one of the refugees from the largest demographic here, from Mali. His name was actually also Ibrahim, funny enough. I remember Freddie told Ibrahim that I had seen the caning earlier that day, and immediately his eyes got somber, and he took my hand and he said, you have to understand, we don't cane these people for no reason. They have to be aware that this needs to be a safe place, because if we cannot trust each other here, then we have nothing. We cannot go to the cops. We can't go to the hospital. If we do, we'll get deported. And another way I saw this visually was one of the men who had gotten caned earlier that day. He didn't have any shoes. His legs were ripped apart, He collapsed in front of us from exhaustion and probably from the caning earlier that day. And my aunt was like, great, you've done it now. We have to take this man to the hospital. And the minute that she said the word hospital, his brother came running up to us and he was like, no, you're not going to take him to the hospital, because if you do that, they're going to deport him and I'm never going to see him again. He's staying here. He's staying here. So we had to leave him. We wrapped his wounds. We left him with a cup of water, and we had to leave him at the camp. So as an American, I was honestly really shocked. Here we have a set in stone, codified rule of law, and we kind of think that anything out of this, rule of law is kind of anarchy, and that's not true. When people can't depend on the government that they find themselves under, they create a new system. They create a stability for themselves with each other. And this is not really any type of anarchy. It's a means of survival. It's a means of keeping the peace. It's a sort of rough justice, if you will. And it's really fascinating and really phenomenal. It reminds me of this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "We are all caught in an inescapable net of mutuality. So if you're not free, then I'm not free either." So this is a struggle for survival that so many of us here have no frame of reference for. We have no idea what's happening every day to millions of people. And these people, they make up the huddled masses, and they're yearning to be free. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Haley Emma Tompkins, and I'm actually the president of AppSpeaks, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. His name is Korik Sisampon, and he's going to be speaking on Hip Hop in the Hilltops.
So how many people in this room today are from the Appalachian region? Raise your hands. Cool, awesome, it's great to meet y'all. And if you didn't get to raise your hands, don't worry about it. We can't all be this cool. But no matter where you were thinking of in your head, you had some sort of idea, some sort of place, a specific place, probably a place that you call home. Maybe you're thinking of a place where you sat on the back porch and you watched thunderstorms roll by, or you're thinking of where you went to school. Maybe you're thinking of a place you moved to or where you are now. But no matter where you're thinking of, you have a place in your mind, and it's a place that matters. Behind me are some lyrics from Jim Garland's I Don't Want Your Millions, Mister. And this is a classic song from the era of grassroots labor resistance that was spearheaded by people from Appalachia. In this lyrics, we see reference to the hard work that miners were putting in just to have their money stolen. We see reference to the simple desire for a job so that you can feed your family. We see reference to being stereotyped as dumb, ignorant, and backwards so that you could be otherized. This song, and many like it, like This Land Is Your Land, 16 Tons, Which Side Are You On, are part of a long history of resistance. These are the songs that have come to define American values so much to the point where I was learning these songs in elementary school. And like I said, they were all born sort of out of an act of resistance. In the face of oppression from coal operators, these people were marching, they were striking, and they were singing these songs that came to define what it meant to be American, that came to embody these American values of freedom, of liberty, and equality. But it wasn't for these high ideals that these people were fighting necessarily. It was for themselves, and it was what was happening to them, and what was happening to the place around them that was sparking these people to perform these acts of resistance. It was the destruction of their environment that led to landslides and mudslides tearing down homes. It was the corrupt deeds that took people's land right out from under them. It was the loss of that place that we all have in our heads right now that we call home that led to this fight for freedom, this fight for liberty, this fight for equality. I'm here to tell you that this tradition is still alive and well today here in Appalachia. However, the tradition is embodied in new voices, and these new voices are speaking over some fat-ass beats. I'm here to tell you that hip-hop, because of its attention to place and because of its inherent insurgency, is the most relevant and the most powerful art form in the region today. Behind me are another set of lyrics from West Virginia rapper Beatty. This is from his song West Virginia Water. And we see a lot of striking similarities between these lyrics and those of Garland's. We see how hardworking people in West Virginia are being exploited and abused in Beatty's eyes. We see how there are still jokes and stereotypes that otherize people. And we see, most importantly, that he's proud of where he's from. He's proud of his place. He's proud of his home. This song was written in 2014 in response to the Elk River chemical spill of the same year. During this spill, 10,000 gallons of MCHM, or methylcyclohexamenethanol, a chemical used for cleaning coal, was spilled into the Elk River, upstream from a water treatment plant that treats all of the water for the Kanawha Valley. 300,000 residents in this valley in 9 counties were left without water for days. They were unable to bathe, unable to cook, unable to drink water unless it came out of a bottle. 14 people were hospitalized, 169 plus were calling into poison control centers complaining of nausea, of rashes, and to make matters worse, this was the 3rd spill in 5 years, and a 4th spill occurred just 6 months after this one. So why do I think that hip-hop is the most relevant form of music today? Firstly, it's because of its inherent insurgency. Michael Eric Dyson, Monty Perry, Murray Foreman, these are all scholars who have connected hip-hop to its environment, to its place of its conception. Dyson has argued that its environment was key to its early aesthetic. It was in post-industrial New York where hip-hop was born. It was, as industries left to go to the South or even to go overseas, this was a massively changing economic context. And hip-hop was right there to respond. It was on the sides of buildings that became the canvases for graffiti artists. It was the corners of streets that became places where ciphers were held, etc. This insurgency, this willingness to respond and to challenge the status quo is what makes hip-hop so powerful. You can see this with one of the greatest albums of all time, Nas's Illmatic. Sohail Dolezai is a scholar who has connected this album to the civil rights movement, to the Black Power movement, to the white backlash to these movements during the Reagan, Bush, Clinton administrations, and it's even been connected to the rise of the modern American police state, which proves how hip-hop has always responded to and attendant to its immediate social and political context. The second reason why I think hip-hop is such a powerful form of music for us today is because it's always so attendant to its place. Murray Foreman has argued that representing place within hip-hop is a way for these artists to show respect for where they're from, for the people that were there, and for the nurture that they provide. Artists are never ashamed in hip-hop to shout out where they were from. You can see this with NWA Straight Outta Compton, which was an emphatic declaration to white America that suburban sunshine doesn't define what black people are going through in America. You can see this with the tragic and dynamic feud between East Coast and West Coast rappers, best exemplified by Biggie and Tupac. You can even see this with Outkast, where at the 1993 or so Source Awards, Andre 3000 felt it was necessary to declare that the South has got something to say, because for so long, Outkast demos had been rejected by record companies simply because they were Southern rappers. When you put all these two things together, you get an incredibly powerful form of art. And I think one great example of this is the music of Isaiah Rashad. He's a rapper from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he is incredibly proud to be from the South. Just the second line on his very first album, he lets you know that he is from the South, and it continues and continues throughout the album. Another great thing about Rashad is that he's incredibly attendant to the problems in his community. One of the main things he talks about is violence in his music. In 2014, when his album was dropped, Chattanooga was ranked the third most violent city in Tennessee based on violent crimes per capita. He also talks a lot about issues of race and racism as someone growing up in the South. He has a line on his first album that references the tragic lynching of Emmett Till. And in an interview about this line, he says that Emmett Till is a lesson that gets passed down. It's something that, it tells us something, the rules that apply throughout this country that people just act like don't apply. He also talks a lot about addiction and substance abuse through his music, bringing attention to the opioid crisis in America. Rashad had a pretty bad Xanax addiction, and it almost completely derailed his career. And this is something that is incredibly important, especially in the context of a discussion about Appalachia. Every day throughout all of America, 90 people die of opioid overdose, and the numbers are incredibly staggering when you look at Appalachia in particular. West Virginia has the highest out of anyone any state in the country. McDowell County, West Virginia, has the highest out of any county in the entire country, with an average of 12 opioid overdose deaths a day. Rashad never forgets where he's from, and he never forgets to talk about these problems through his music. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful thing that we need to be paying attention to. One of the most compelling changing contexts in Appalachia today is the shift from the previously predominant coal industry to the prison industry. In these communities where coal used to be dominant, these communities are turning towards prisons as a recession-proof economic lifeline. They see this as a way to bring jobs to these communities, to bring other companies, to bring more jobs to these communities, and ultimately bring stability to these communities. However, with prisons come a lot of problems, and hip-hop has recognized these problems in Appalachia and responded to them beautifully. Hip-Hop from the Hilltop is a program that's broadcast from WMMT in Whitesburg, Kentucky. And it's one of two hip-hop only programs that are broadcast within the region. They have this initiative that they call Calls from Home, and this tackles the problem of prisons head on. So one thing you have when you have all these prisons being built is not all these inmates are coming from Appalachia in particular. They're coming from the Northeast, they're coming from the West, they're coming from deeper in the South. And that's expensive. It's expensive to call long distance. It's expensive to travel long distance. For example, I've only talked to my uncle once since he got locked back up. and I had to split that phone time with my dad. So like, it's incredibly expensive for these people to communicate with their loved ones. So what Calls from Home does is it allows these families to call into the radio station, record a message for their incarcerated loved ones, and then Hip Hop from the Hilltop broadcasts that message into prisons so that on some level these inmates can have some form of contact with those who they love. So, much like artists from the past, hip hop always pays attention to where it is and what's going on around it. They don't let any of these problems escape without a spotlight. These artists don't let any problems escape without a spotlight. And they don't let any of these problems escape without criticism of the underlying assumptions that these problems or the implications that these problems are causing. Artists like Beatty and Rashad are bringing awareness to racism. They're bringing awareness to the opioid epidemic. They're bringing awareness to the continuing overwhelming power of the coal industry. And the programs like Hip Hop from the Hilltop and Calls from Home are doing something really tangible to solve back for some of the harms that are presented by the coal industry. And it's because of this attention to place, and because of this inherent insurgency, this willingness to challenge the status quo, that I believe hip-hop is the most relevant and the most powerful form of music, not only within Appalachia, but within America as a whole. Thank you.
Our next speaker now is James Furr with his topic of potential for electric aircraft racing.
Thank you. Hello. All right. I apologize to everybody in advance. I will be talking a little bit about numbers. So, potential for electric air racing. I have to use the word potential because there are no electric air racers. There is one under construction currently, but we'll get into that in a moment. So, talk to you a little bit about who I am. I'm a physics and sustainable technology major. I'm a part of the Appalachian State Solar Vehicle team, and I'm an aviation enthusiast. One of my earliest memories is of my mother taking me to the Charlotte Douglas Airport and watching planes take off and land prior to 9/11, where you couldn't do that anymore. But I think that's one of the things that has really stuck with me, and I've just been super enthralled with, the idea of flying and developing aircraft. But as time has gone on, I've become aware of problems that we as a species faces with climate change. So I thought, well, how could we potentially solve this? Even though aviation isn't the biggest slice of the pie, it is the fastest growing, according to The Economist. So I thought, well, why not just make electric aircraft? So I looked into it, and one of the most interesting examples, one of the things that really inspired this project, though, was the dawn of the electric car. These are two electric cars that have just been announced that are coming out. This is the Tesla Roadster 2.0, and this is the Raycon Concept 2. Both these cars are pretty crazy. Some of the figures on them is they go from 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. That'll smoke any Ferrari. And they have a top speed of over 250 miles per hour. The fastest piston engine car in the world is the Bugatti Veyron, and that tops out at 267 miles per hour. So this is within almost world record-breaking speeds here. So I thought, okay, maybe this can be competitive for, piston engine powered planes. We don't really use those anymore because of the jet engine. However, there are still prop planes that come into play. So maybe if there's a competitor, maybe we can have an electric, they can compete on a economic front. So one of the things that I found during my research was electroflight. And electroflight's a really cool project. They haven't gotten it flying yet, but it's almost here. So it was started by Robert Target. He's the founder. And it's all based on the idea that a Red Bull air race takes place, and you have to run through the pylons in roughly 30 seconds. So the plane only needs to fly for 10 minutes. So It's a really radical idea, but I think it's crazy enough that it might actually be competitive. So you can cut a lot of weight out. But it has a top speed of 300 miles per hour. The world piston engine prop speed is 538 miles per hour, and that was set in last October by a piston engine plane. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the capabilities of an electric motor, and it might seem to make sense why they would be competitive. One of my favorite air racing events is the Reno Unlimited Gold Air Race, and this is where actually they set the world record. This is the fastest race on the planet. These planes cruise around a 9-mile circuit at around 500 miles per hour. The whole race takes place in less than 12 minutes. They're so fast, they need a jet plane to basically pace them. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the design of a Reno Air Racer, these two are the same plane. They're both P-51s. They're both World War II era fighters. However, this one has been extensively modified for modern air racing. So what we have here is a different engine, a different cockpit as opposed to here, and different radiator shape and different wings. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. So they're by no means out of date. Okay. So here's the electric motor versus the piston engine. Now, there are a lot of facts and figures, and I do apologize, but you'll understand why I have them up here. The electric motor, which is taken from a Tesla, we have the weights here and the power here, and we like to use kilowatts because I'm a physics student. We do things in metric. A kilowatt is roughly, 100 horsepower is 75 kilowatts, roughly. So, and what I'm going to do here is reduce that to power density. So that's how much weight you need for the amount of power you produce. For the piston engine, I have selected a Mercedes F1 W06 hybrid, top of the line. Can't get any better than that. It's 44% max efficient. Your typical car is roughly 30. And it gets 1 kilowatt per kilogram, which is, for a piston engine, incredible. However, this is a Tesla motor from a Tesla Model S. It's 91% peak efficient, which means for cruising, you're using almost everything that you put into it. You have minimal losses. And it's got a power density 3 times higher than a Formula One engine, which is that's insane. You can have something the size of a watermelon producing as much power as a typical car engine, which is crazy. So there's a difference between typical car engines and aircraft engines. The aircraft engine has to have a compressor due to altitude. The higher you go in the atmosphere, the less oxygen you have to burn. Another thing that you have to have is a reduction gear, which is over here. And what that does is your engine gets the most horsepower at a certain RPM, but your propeller has to rotate at a certain RPM for it to be most efficient, so you have to account for that. With an electric motor, you can just design the thing to be the most efficient at whatever RPM you design it for, so you completely throw out all these systems that you need. You don't need oxygen for batteries because all it is electricity flowing through a wire, creating an electromagnetic field, which applies force on magnets. So it's very simple. You throw out a lot of complexity, throw out a lot of weight. Now, the big issue with electric things in general, anything electric really, is the energy storage. What I have here are a bunch of charts that kind of show the power densities of the batteries, but if you see the chart on the far left, batteries aren't even in the same league. They're not even close to gasoline and diesel. A lithium-ion battery, what we do is we use watt-hours per kilogram, which is a power density, is only 250 watt-hours per kilogram, which seems pretty good until you compare it to gasoline, which is 13,000 watt-hours per kilogram. However, despite batteries being so bad, the fact of the matter is the electric motor is so efficient that you make up for a lot of that lost power capacity. What I think is the real nail in the coffin here is the advancement in materials. Since these planes were made in the Second World War, they use aluminum. What we have now is carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is lighter and stronger than aluminum, not to mention that instead of having to rivet it to a bunch of different internal structural pieces to hold the thing together, you can just cast it in a mold and it pops out and you just glue it onto your fuselage. It's that simple. So simplicity is super important for efficiency and weight reduction. So now that the technology seems competitive against piston engines, why of all things racing? Well, my background being a part of the Appalachian State Solar Vehicle team has taught me that racing gets people excited. What are you going to be more excited to learn about? A race car or a minivan? So yeah, and I really think that this is the perfect platform. Air racing is the perfect platform to generate hype and generate awareness and make companies take a real interest and take a good second look at this technology and see if it's viable. Thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker is Robert Havelka, and he's going to be speaking on markets and making America greater.
Thank you. Hope everyone's having a good evening so far. I take it you probably are. We got a lot of good speakers. But I've got a huge confession to make, and that is that I'm about to ruin it for you, right? Because I'm a huge geek. And essentially what that means is that I like to talk about some pretty boring stuff, namely economics. But particularly tonight, we're going to look at these economic trends that I want to talk about through a political lens. Because I think it's kind of important to especially look at something like a focal point, like the 2016 election, that we can, I think, all relate to, right? Kind of hard for any one of us to escape that. And to examine that and see what are some of these implications of these decades-long economic trends. And for some of us, it ended like a Shakespearean tragedy, right, with the fatally flawed hero not making it to the finish line. And for some others of us, it was a Homerian epic, right, where Donald Trump valiantly enters the White House. But most importantly, really is not a matter of whether or not you really wanted one or the other. What's most important is that I think we can all understand that something fishy was going on, right, that it just did not feel right. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about Russian emails, right, or private email servers and collusion and everything else like that, because that's not the point of this, right? The point is economics. And in order to get down to the brass tacks of all this kind of stuff, I figured let's start with Bernie Sanders, right? Hillary Clinton's primary opponent. Now, the interesting thing about this fellow is not whether or not he may or may not be considered one of the more honest politicians, at least to how they stick to their line, but the fact that he has been saying the same thing for 40 years, right? And all of a sudden, people start paying attention to him. That's an interesting development, particularly because the vast majority of the people that actually really followed Bernie Sanders with bloodlust weren't even a twinkle in their parents' eyes when he began his career in politics, not even when he was born, right? Of course, another interesting anomaly during this election would be Donald Trump himself, right, in the opposite end of the spectrum. Now, you know, he is a known quantity, right, whether culturally, entertainment-wise, or in the business world, but more or less a political afterthought, and I think we saw that throughout the primaries and everything else like that. And yet he little-handedly managed to find a way to sidestep the most powerful, well-funded, and experienced politicians in the Republican Party. And he repeated the play in the general election. That is a huge development, folks, and we cannot ignore it no matter how much we may or may not like it, right? And I know that against better judgment, I decided to say, let's maybe ask the American people what they were thinking, right, and how they felt, right? But I think it's actually pretty compelling to look at some of these statistics, particularly that on both sides of the political spectrum, people wanted change, which is interesting because, you know, comparatively to the previous two administrations, Obama left office relatively popular, right? Certainly more popular than either Bill Clinton or George Bush. So the idea that he's the change guy and people are still hungry for more on either side of the spectrum leaves us to believe that there is something wrong, right, with this calculus. Particularly the fact that the economy is such a salient issue. Now, in every exit poll, you're going to find the economy sits at 1 or 2, right? I mean, we're all care, you know, about where we get our money and how we get a job and how we pay our bills, right? It's probably the greatest source of anxiety. But to be so far ahead of these other rather compelling subjects means that there is, in fact, something strange going on here. Particularly because, don't just take it from me, but the stock market is, for all intents and purposes, doing pretty good, right? We have now, for the past 5 years, pretty much hit record highs it seems like every other week, if not month, according to the news media, right? And you might be thinking, it's the jobs. Well, we can argue all day about whether or not these are enough jobs being created, but for almost 9 years now, it's been straight positive net job growth. So again, where is this economic anxiety coming from? Now, the knee-jerk reaction, of course, is to blame Obama's secret chief economic advisor, Karl Marx, pictured here in 2008 on election night. But I think it's a bit more serious than that, and it's a bit more closer to home, right? Because it's a little strange to think that if there really was this overwhelming Marxist, socialist, communist menace, the beating heart of American capitalism, the stock market, certainly would not be humming along as pleasantly as it seems to be, right? Correction or otherwise in the past month. I think we need to look more to America's own economic Yoda, Milton Friedman, right? Who in this quote pretty much is encapsulated in his philosophies and his influence, right? Because although we all understand it's kind of absurd that the Sahara Desert runs out of sand at all, right? And I know, environmental science majors, we know desertification, we get it. But the point is, right, is that every single one of us can relate to this quote, particularly with the idea of the politics or the ideas of government we don't like. We certainly attribute this philosophy, right? Inherently inept, it shouldn't be doing it. And that is a tremendous legacy that he's left. There's a funny word for it called neoliberalism in a variety of ways as to how he has truly affected the American political and economic psyche. And in a lot of ways, it's a very strange term, and people have obviously hang-ups with the word liberal on either side of the spectrum. But pretty much think about it as carte blanche deregulation and tax cuts, right? Which can be good or bad. But at the end of the day, that really doesn't sum it up for us, right? That is not a good enough explanation. So instead, because this being economics, we have graphs aplenty, don't you worry. Right here what you'll find is that up until the 1970s, we see hourly compensation and productivity matching each other or reflexively working together. And it was considered kind of a golden economic rule, right? Because at the end of the day, if you are more productive, whether you're selling more goods or more services, you're making more value, and at some point you're going to be somewhat compensated for it. It was kind of this idea of I'm getting mine, so I guess you'll get yours, right? And then it doesn't do that anymore, right? And of course, the cultural context of the 1970s is pretty substantial, right? People can't get gas, they barely have a job with a stagnating economy, and hyperinflation is out the wazoo, not to mention that Americans just got done watching, while eating their TV dinner, their president resign and fly away on a helicopter, right? And hold off on fantasizing about that, some of you, right? Currently, because there is something really important happening here, right? Particularly, I like to call it, and I've branded it myself, the Destiny's Child effect. Hashtag Destiny's Child effect. And the reason why you want to understand it like this is because, up until the 70s, right, Beyonce, Kelly, and Michelle are all mutualistically collaborating, right? They're all providing great things for each other. Some people might say Beyonce's better, some people might not, but either way, they're all moving forward together, right? And then Beyonce sees the writing on the wall and says, nope, and skyrockets up to the top of productivity, right? Hashtag goddess, because we all glamour over her on Twitter. And Kelly and Michelle are stuck with the rest of us here at this kind of subpar increase for hourly compensation. And it has some real-world implications because the value is going somewhere, so let's figure out where. Well, in this fun graph, we can find that at the top we see CEOs' pay, right? Quickly followed by corporate profits and the S&P 500. And they kind of mirror each other, which is no coinky-dink at all. But what's weird is that our lines there at the bottom are relatively stagnant, and that's kind of depressing, right? But maybe that doesn't quite do it for you, right? How about the average Wall Street bonus, right, compared to the average American worker's salary? The trend line barely inches forward for the average American worker, and the bonus, right, we're not even talking about the salary here, this is like the, hey, you did a great job, is like 4.5 times that of the salary of the worker, right? This is where some places where this value is going. Particularly, I think it's kind of scary, the idea that the richest 62 people in the country can manage to own as much wealth as the bottom 150 to 200 million. That's kind of an absurd number, right? Less than 100 almost equates a couple hundred million. And importantly, a lot of us have been told things like, just put your money in the stock market, right? The stock market's doing well, so that's a great way to expand your sources of income, because that's how you build wealth. Well, in a way, that understanding is not necessarily as antiquated as the grandfather that's telling you to do that. It's just that we're fighting for a pitifully small piece of the pie, because the richest 10% own 93% of all valuable stock, right? So not only are we fighting for that small piece of the pie, but we're making almost nothing with which to invest into that. And that's an important trend, because it's not as if this value isn't being created and being created by us, assuming that none of us are in the top 10% of the income bracket now. But it just means that it's like almost being suffocated and accumulated elsewhere, whereas before this didn't happen, right? So it's not just a natural order of things. It kind of leads us to believe that there are other issues that lend this to happen. And it all starts back with hourly compensation and productivity, right? It starts back with this fact that the trend lines start to develop this large gap. And we can all understand where I'm kind of going with this, right? It's increasingly that we're playing with fewer and fewer pieces on the chessboard to represent ourselves, and eventually, especially for many Americans, honestly, we feel like the pawns, right? We don't actually feel like we have that sense of voice. And some people would say that the way to remedy this is to, go ahead and make Marx cool again, and I don't think that's the case. In fact, it's looking at people like, for example, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, who is a blue dog Democrat, not your atypical big government Democrat, mind you, and from Virginia, right? Which is, of course, a great way for him to balance the ticket as Hillary Clinton became extremely progressive, right, in response to Bernie Sanders. But it's that sort of compromise that kind of gets us here, right? And the same thing can be said for current Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and, former vice presidential candidate for Mitt Romney, right? He's the business guru, right? He is the, neoliberal in chief, essentially. And it's that same sort of balancing act that he provides, right? Because at the end of the day, really what happens when we compromise is that we're just compromising on our standard of living, no one else's. My personal favorite, however, is a man whose name needs no punchline, former Speaker of the House, Dick Armey, right? Who co-authored a contract with America and managed to pass some of the most comprehensive, moderate reforms with President Bill Clinton, right? The great compromiser in chief himself. And it was lauded as a victory for all of us, but between the discussions of NAFTA and TPP and all sorts of other things that 20 years later we're seeing some of the really flagrant ramifications of, we're starting to pick up on the fact that maybe, just maybe, it's not the case. And again, it's not making Marx cool that's necessarily going to solve all of this, right? I'm not sitting here trying to stand on my stump and preach as if it's, the year 1840. But maybe we can look at some of the critiques, but more importantly, and this is single-handedly the most important thing you can take away from this presentation, and that is that we need to get Destiny's Child back together, all right? Hashtag Destiny's Child effect. But in all seriousness, it's really the fact that we need to go back to this trend line, and we need to make them represent and reflect each other again, right? That is the Destiny's Child effect. We need to bring it back together, preferably lifting hourly compensation up to productivity, right, as opposed to the other way around. And if these graphs, don't really make it really palatable or personal enough for you, and I tried with Destiny's Child, I really did, just go ahead and take whatever it is that you make right now and double it. That's the difference in growth, right? That is the value you've lost, is 50% of the value over the course of 40 years of your labor, right? And for someone like me, it was long lost before I even got here. But it's a continuing trend, and I'm scared, and I want it back, right? And the real political ramifications and social ramifications, right, for this country are that we're going to continue to get farcical elections like 2016, right, where it's this entertainment buzz type lifestyle, and it starts to look like a reality TV show featuring 3 really angry octogenarians. And that is not good for this country, no matter what side of the stump you choose to stand on. Thank you.
And now for our next speaker, Mackenzie Bruckner, with her topic of narrative and nostalgia.
Thank you. Okay, cool. All right. We are living during a time of massive change and political upheaval. There's a lot of extreme arguments on both sides dividing our society today. And I'm about to say something that's going to upset a lot of you. The original is not always better than the remake. I know, I'm really funny. But at the end of the day, humor me. if it is so much better than the original, why do we keep adapting the same story? More importantly, how do we keep adapting the same story? Well, humans are and always have been natural storytellers, repeating the same stories in different contexts to reflect the shifting cultural values. As these political and social ideas are shifting and growing, we need to be able to update our narratives in order to reflect those cultural changes. The best way that we do this is through television. Television is how we learn about ourselves and our culture. Television provides us with a collective vocabulary on how to talk about people and situations that we encounter in our daily life. Essentially, our language informs our reality. The things that we say affect the ways that we treat other people, and it's something that deserves delving into. I suggest that a collective and cultural longing for the good old days inspires these generations of remakes from more contemporary positions. This nostalgia, if you will, creates a frame that we see television through. We're looking at the past from a position of the present and a nostalgic sentiment of, look how far we've come. These sentiments are actually really problematic as it can cause us to overlook uncomfortable truths about where we actually are in society today. This frame of nostalgia is a double-edged sword. Either we can confront a problem with it from this comfortable space that it creates for us, or we get too comfortable and thus locate these problems outside of our current experiences and thus lack engagement with them on a sincere level to actually get some sort of solvency. My first example for this is Mad Men. Mad Men creates too comfortable of a nostalgic space that allows us to misplace problems that still plague our society today in another time period. So how is Mad Men an adaptation, right? It's a historical adaptation of a time period of a 1960s advertising agency, mostly revolving around the life and times of Don Draper. Technically, it is an adaptation of this historical period because while it may be relatively historically accurate, there's a lot of artistic liberties taken to present to you what you see on screen. And if you've never heard of Mad Men, you've probably heard of smooth-talking, impressively dressed, suave playboy Don Draper, who, despite all of his flaws, which are certainly never hidden from the audience and range from infidelity to manipulation, people still want to be Don Draper. If we can all admit that he's not a great person, why do we still want to be Don Draper? I think it's because of our nostalgia and our current contemporary positioning. It allows us to place his flaws outside of our contemporary surroundings and into his 1960s advertising office outside of us. These ideas of we're better now and look how far we've come allow us to place these things here. My first example of this is in episode 1 of the whole Mad Men series. We kind of open up on Don Draper interacting with a black waiter. Now, he seems to be defending him from this racist, violent boss and having a relatively polite conversation with him, but at the end of the day, we see him using him for his own needs and then dismissing him at the end of this conversation. He's still objectifying this individual, and that's problematic. However, Don Draper comes off as this shining white knight in a world of racist problems that need to be addressed. After all, we're able to locate this racism outside of our contemporary surroundings. We had a black president, so racism is dead, right? That is wrong. Essentially, we are required to have to step out of this comfortability in order to actually address problems like racism and how they're still affecting us today. An example of an adaptation that effectively utilizes nostalgia to create this comfortable space for us in order to better deal with problems is Queer Eye. Queer Eye is an adaptation of the 2003 to 2007 hit Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, in which a team of 5 queer-identifying individuals travel around and give well-deserved makeovers to people a little bit down on their luck. In the very first theme intro of the adaptation, the team says that the original was fighting for tolerance. The new version is fighting for acceptance. This alone allows the remake to position the audience in a position of comfortability and familiar concepts in order to better engage with the problematic topics like frank conversations on sexuality, mental health, and even the police. In this instance, I think the remake is better than the original. Now, I'm not saying that the original is not absolutely amazing, just that the adaptation was able to adapt itself to reflect its new political and social context. Specifically, Queer Eye utilizes this nostalgic space in order to encourage the challenging of stereotypes. For example, the South is often associated with conservative ideologies and traditional values, which are then, in turn, traditionally associated with anti-queer sentiment. The Queer Eye headquarters relocates from New York City to Atlanta, Georgia, to confront and challenge this idea that queerness is not accepted in the South. Throughout the series, we see them interacting with all sorts of Southern identities and individuals who some people might think wouldn't be accepting of a queer individual, and yet we see that they very much are. In this way, Queer Eye is really able to successfully use this comfortable space to engage with topics that might make people uncomfortable. An example of an adaptation that utilizes nostalgia problematically to make us a little bit perhaps too comfortable in this space is The Office US. The Office US is an adaptation of The Office UK and is essentially a comedic mockumentary about 2000s office life in a mid-range paper supply firm with a pretty unusual boss. Initially, the first season of The Office US was entirely a shot-for-shot remake of The Office UK. Because of this, it was not responding to its new political and social context, and it ended up being the least popular of the the total of 9 seasons. It wasn't able to adapt to its new and cultural surrounding. Once it did, it became one of the most popular television shows of our time. And in that, if you haven't heard of The Office, you've probably heard of Michael Scott, who is essentially comedy's Don Draper. He's not perfect, and he's often problematic, but fans and characters alike love him despite these flaws. One of Michael Scott's more hilariously problematic, or perhaps problematically hilarious moments is in season 3, episode 1, titled Gay Witch Hunt, in which one of his employees comes to him and says that he is uncomfortable with gay jokes as he does identify as gay. The entire episode, we see Michael fighting to prove that he has some lack of homophobia, while his actions and his practices throughout the episode merely perpetuate these underlying problems. For example, he ends up calling an office meeting in which he outs this gentleman to the entire office and then sexually harasses him by kissing him on the mouth to attempt to show his lack of homophobia. In this way, he is perpetuating these stereotypes while also attempting to battle them. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be laughing at Michael Scott, but what I'm saying is we should be using that laughter to look at those underlying messages and actually have a springboard for more progressive discussion. With these examples, we can see the complexities of the nostalgic frame. It's great to be able to have a comfortable space in order to laugh at these over-exaggerated stereotypes, but it creates a lack of space for us to actually seriously engage with the problem, because we're locating them outside of ourselves, in this case, Michael Scott's homophobia, into another time and space. Chances are, if Michael Scott isn't your boss, you don't have to deal with these problems. Essentially, what do all of these adaptations tell us about ourselves? Well, that the nostalgic frame is an effective tool to be able to allow for this engagement with certain topics. However, it can cause a lot of problems to be overlooked that aren't being solved, discussed, or even acknowledged. Television is a great low-stakes way to be able to engage with these serious social problems, and as audiences, we should be aware of the presentation of those problems and those stories to us on the television. Essentially, television reflects our cultural values. We learn who we are from television. We visit the past, explore the present, and even voyage into the future. And being able to recognize the frames through which our cultural narratives are presented to us ultimately will make us better audiences and even possibly conscious cultural actors that are willing to engage in these serious and social conversations. Thank you.